Late one winter evening, the small town of Ridgewood was blanketed in snow, its quiet streets shimmering under the pale glow of streetlights. The air was sharp and biting, carrying with it the kind of cold that made even the shortest walk feel like an Arctic expedition. Robert Callahan, a man known for his calm demeanor and quick thinking, was driving home after a long day at work. His car's tires crunched softly over the icy roads as he approached a stop sign on the edge of town. Robert slowed down carefully, mindful of the slippery conditions. But just as he came to a halt, his back tire skidded slightly on a patch of black ice. It wasn't much, just a minor slip, but it was enough to catch the attention of two police officers parked nearby. Their patrol car lights flashed suddenly, bathing Robert's vehicle in alternating red and blue hues. He sighed, pulling over to the side of the road. The officers approached his car with an air of authority, their boots crunching against the frozen ground. One of them tapped on the window, motioning for Robert to roll it down. As the glass descended, a gust of frigid air rushed into the car, making Robert shiver. "License and registration," the taller officer barked, his breath visible in the cold night air. Robert nodded politely, handing over the requested documents without argument. As the officers examined his papers under the hood of their patrol car, Robert couldn't shake the feeling that something about this stop felt off. He hadn't run a red light or exceeded the speed limit. His only mistake had been the brief skid. Still, he remained calm, assuming this would be nothing more than a routine check. But when the officers returned, their expressions were stony, almost hostile. "You think this is a game?" the shorter officer asked, his voice dripping with accusation. Robert blinked in confusion. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't understand. I stopped at the sign, but my tire slipped, that's all." His explanation seemed reasonable enough, but the officers weren't interested in listening. Instead, they exchanged glances, smirking faintly as though sharing some private joke at his expense. Before Robert could say another word, the taller officer leaned closer to his window, his tone mocking. "You're telling us how to do our job now? Maybe we should teach you a lesson instead." Without warning, both officers ordered him out of the car. The temperature outside was brutally cold, and Robert hesitated, unsure what was happening. "Is there a problem, officers?" he asked cautiously, stepping onto the icy pavement. But the officers didn't answer. They simply stood there, watching, him with unreadable expressions. Then, with a sneer, the shorter one said, "Drop and give me 20 push-ups right here. Let's see if you can handle a little discipline." Robert stared at them, disbelief washing over him. Was this really happening? In the middle of a freezing night with snowflakes clinging to his coat, he realized arguing would only make things worse. For now, he decided to comply. But deep inside, something shifted. This wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. It was personal. The biting cold gnawed at Robert's fingers and toes as he stood on the side of the road, his breath forming small clouds in the frosty air. The two officers loomed over him, their expressions a mix of amusement and authority. One of them pointed to the ground, where patches of snow lay scattered across the asphalt. "You heard me," the shorter officer repeated, his tone mocking. "Get down 20 push-ups now." Robert clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He knew resisting would only escalate the situation, but the absurdity of what they were asking stung more than the icy wind. Forcing himself to stay calm, he slowly lowered himself onto the frozen pavement. His hands pressed into the hard surface, sending a jolt of cold through his palms. The snow crunched beneath him as he began the first push-up. Each movement felt heavier than the last, not just because of the physical effort, but because of the weight of humiliation pressing down on him. Cars drove by intermittently, their headlights illuminating the surreal scene. Some drivers slowed down, curious about why a man in a suit was doing push-ups in the snow under the watchful eyes of two uniformed officers. A few honked, perhaps mistaking it for some strange roadside prank. Others simply stared before driving off, leaving Robert alone with his tormentors. As he counted silently in his head, Robert couldn't help but notice the smug looks exchanged between the officers. They weren't just punishing him. They were enjoying it. Every grunt, every labored breath seemed to fuel their satisfaction. "Faster," One of them barked when Robert's pace slowed. He pushed harder, his muscles burning from the exertion and the biting cold seeping into his bones. By the time he reached 15, his arms trembled with exhaustion, and his chest tightened against the icy air filling his lungs. But he refused to stop or show weakness. Instead, he focused on the rhythmic crunch of snow beneath his hands, using it as a distraction from the anger boiling inside him. This wasn't justice. It was cruelty disguised as authority. And yet, there was nothing he could do in that moment, except finish what they had demanded. When he finally completed the 20th push-up, Robert rolled onto his side, gasping for breath. His suit jacket was damp from melted snow and his hands were numb. He looked up at the officers, waiting for them to say something, anything, that might justify what had just happened. But all they did was smirk. "That'll teach you to follow the rules next time," one of them said casually, as though they hadn't just humiliated an innocent man in sub-zero temperatures. Robert stood slowly, brushing snow off his clothes. His face was flushed not just from exertion but from the sheer indignity of it all. As much as he wanted to lash out, he knew better. Arguing now would only give them more ammunition to use against him. So instead, he nodded stiffly, climbed back into his car and drove away. The image of their smirking faces burned into his memory. But as the heat from his car's vents began thawing his frozen hands, something else stirred within him. Anger, yes, but also determination. What had happened wasn't just about him. It was part of a bigger problem. Those officers clearly believed they were untouchable, free to abuse their power without consequence. And while Robert couldn't undo what had been done to him, he vowed silently that this wouldn't be the end of the story. If anything, it was the beginning. The next morning, Robert woke up to the dull ache in his arms and shoulders, a painful reminder of the push-ups he had been forced to do in the freezing cold. As he stood by the window, sipping a steaming cup of coffee, he watched the sun rise over the frost-covered rooftops of Ridgewood. The world outside seemed calm and peaceful, but inside him, a storm was brewing. Every time he replayed the events of the previous night in his mind, the anger grew stronger. He thought about how those officers had treated him, not as someone who made a minor driving mistake, but as if he were some criminal deserving punishment. Their smirks, their taunts, the way they enjoyed asserting power over him. It wasn't just humiliating, it felt wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. Robert knew that this wasn't an isolated incident. He'd heard stories before, friends, colleagues, even strangers sharing accounts of similar treatment at the hands of law enforcement. But now, it had happened to him, and he couldn't let it go unanswered. As the CEO of Integrity Solutions, Robert had spent years building a reputation for fairness and integrity. His company created software designed to improve transparency within police departments, helping them track misconduct and hold officers accountable. Ironically, one of his biggest clients was the very department those two officers belonged to. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, working to help police forces become better, while two of their own had crossed the line with him personally. Sitting down at his desk, Robert opened his laptop and began digging deeper. Using public records and his professional network, he started researching the officers involved in his ordeal. What he found shocked him. Both men had histories of complaints filed against them, accusations ranging from verbal abuse to excessive use of force. Yet none of these complaints had led to serious consequences. It was as though they operated above the law, shielded by bureaucracy and indifference. The more Robert read, the angrier he became. But beneath the anger was something else: resolve. He realized that this wasn't just about getting back at the officers who humiliated him. This was about sending a message that no one, not even those sworn to protect and serve, was above accountability. For too long, bad behavior had gone unchecked because people didn't speak up or lacked the means to fight back. But Robert wasn't just anyone. He had resources, influence, and a platform, and he intended to use all of them. By mid-morning, Robert had drafted a plan. First, he would contact the local police chief directly, presenting the evidence he'd gathered and demanding answers. If the department refused to take action, He would escalate matters further, starting with ending Integrity Solutions' partnership with them. Losing such a lucrative contract would hurt, especially since his company relied heavily on government partnerships. But Robert didn't care. Money wasn't the point. Justice was. As he finalized his notes, Robert leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He knew what lay ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance, criticism, maybe even retaliation. But none of that mattered anymore. What happened to him the night before wasn't just an insult to his dignity. It was a symptom of a much larger problem. And if he could shine a light on it, expose its flaws and push for change, then every uncomfortable moment, every sleepless night, would be worth it. With renewed determination, Robert grabbed his coat and headed out the door. Today, he decided, was the day he stopped being a bystander and started fighting back. Robert's investigation into the two officers quickly turned into a mission. He spent hours combing through public records, news articles, and internal police reports, all while piecing together a clearer picture of who these men were and what they had done before crossing paths with him. The more he uncovered, the more troubling the story became. Complaints about their behavior stretched back years, filed by ordinary citizens who had been subjected to similar treatment: verbal intimidation, unnecessary force, and outright humiliation. Yet in every case, the officers had walked away unscathed. What struck Robert most was how casually these incidents seemed to be dismissed. In one instance, a young woman reported being shouted at during a routine traffic stop, for no apparent reason other than talking back. Another complaint came from an elderly man who claimed he was forced to wait outside in the rain for over an hour because the same officers suspected him of loitering, despite having no evidence. Each time, the department issued vague statements about ongoing reviews or training improvements, but nothing ever changed. It was as though the system itself was designed to protect them. Armed with this information, Robert decided it was time to confront the problem head-on. He called the local police chief requesting an urgent meeting. When the chief hesitated, citing a busy schedule, Robert didn't back down. "This concerns your department's reputation and mine," he said firmly. "We need to talk." Reluctantly, the chief agreed. The next day, Robert arrived at the police station dressed in his usual sharp suit, carrying a folder filled with documents. The chief greeted him in his office, a spacious room decorated with awards and framed photos meant to project authority. But Robert wasn't intimidated. After exchanging polite pleasantries, he got straight to the point. "I'm here because of something that happened to me recently," Robert began, placing the folder on the desk. "Two of your officers pulled me over last night and treated me in a way that was unacceptable. I did nothing wrong, yet I was humiliated in front of my community for no reason." The chief frowned, clearly uneasy. "Mr. Callahan, I assure you, we take all complaints seriously. Do you?" Robert interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "Because when I looked into these officers' records, I found a pattern. Multiple complaints, no accountability, and now they've added me to their list." He opened the folder and slid several printed pages across the desk. "These are just a few examples. You can see for yourself." The chief glanced at the papers, his expression growing increasingly uncomfortable. I'll look into this immediately," he stammered. "If there's misconduct, rest assured we'll address it." But Robert wasn't satisfied with empty promises. Leaning forward slightly, he fixed the chief with a steady gaze. "That's not enough. Your department has a responsibility to the people it serves, to protect them, not abuse them. If you won't hold these officers accountable, then someone else will have to." The chief blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" Robert paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Integrity Solutions partners with law enforcement agencies across the country. We provide tools to improve transparency and accountability. But if your department isn't willing to live up to those values, then we can't continue working together. I'll terminate our contract, and trust me, others will follow." For a moment, the room was silent. The chief stared at Robert, clearly, weighing the implications of what he'd just heard. Finally, he nodded slowly. "You're right," he admitted. "This needs to change. Give me a week to review everything and present a plan." Robert stood, extending his hand. "A week is all you get. After that, I expect results, or actions will speak louder than words." As he left the station, Robert felt a mix of satisfaction and unease. He knew the fight was far from over, but one thing was certain: he had thrown down the gauntlet. Now, it was up to the department to respond. The quarterly review meeting at Integrity Solutions headquarters was in full swing when Robert stepped into the boardroom. The large, sleek space buzzed with quiet chatter as representatives from various police departments shuffled through papers and sipped coffee. These meetings were usually routine, a chance to discuss software updates, address concerns, and strengthen partnerships. But today, Robert had something else on his mind. He took his place at the head of the table, glancing around at the attendees. Among them were officials from the very department that employed the two officers who had humiliated him. They sat casually, unaware of what was about to unfold. For a moment, Robert felt a pang of nervousness, but he quickly pushed it aside. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about sending a message. Clearing his throat, Robert began the presentation as usual, walking the group through recent developments and upcoming features for their accountability software. His tone was calm and professional, lulling everyone into a false sense of normalcy. Halfway through, he paused, setting down his notes. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward him. "I want to take a moment to talk about something important," Robert said, his voice steady but carrying an edge. He clicked a button on the remote and the screen behind him changed. Instead of graphs or data points, it displayed a photograph, a dimly lit roadside, a man doing push-ups in the snow under the watchful gaze of two uniformed officers. Gasps rippled through the room as recognition dawned on some faces. "This is me," Robert continued, pointing to the image. "Last week I was pulled over by two officers from one of your departments." He let the words hang in the air before continuing. "I didn't break any laws, just a minor skid on an icy road. Yet I was humiliated, forced to do push-ups in freezing weather while strangers drove by and watched." The atmosphere shifted instantly. Some attendees shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others exchanged uneasy glances. One representative from the offending department cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Callahan, this is unfortunate, but surely we can resolve this privately." Robert shook his head. "This isn't about me," he replied firmly. "It's about accountability. Those officers have a history of misconduct, complaints stretching back years, and yet nothing has been done. How can we trust departments like yours to use our tools effectively if you won't even hold your own people accountable?" He paused, letting his words sink in. Then, with quiet authority, he delivered the blow. "Integrity Solutions will no longer partner with departments unwilling to enforce real change. If you refuse to act, I'll terminate our contracts. And believe me, other companies will follow suit." A stunned silence filled the room. Whispers broke out as representatives processed what they'd just heard. Some looked angry, others shocked, but none could deny the gravity of Robert's ultimatum. One woman raised her hand hesitantly. "What exactly are you asking us to do?" she asked. "Simple," Robert answered. "Investigate these officers thoroughly. Hold them accountable for their actions. Implement reforms to ensure this doesn't happen again. Prove to me, and to the communities you serve, that you're serious about earning trust." As the meeting concluded, the tension in the room was palpable. Some representatives left visibly shaken, while others lingered to ask questions or express support. Robert knew not everyone would agree with his decision, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the ripple effect he hoped to create. By taking a stand, he had forced these departments to confront uncomfortable truths and given them a choice: evolve or face consequences. Walking out of the boardroom, Robert felt a mix of exhaustion and determination. The battle was far from over, but he had ignited something powerful, a conversation that couldn't be ignored. And sometimes, That was enough to spark real change. The days following Robert's bold announcement at the quarterly meeting were a whirlwind of reactions. News of his ultimatum spread like wildfire, not just within law enforcement circles but across the entire town, and soon, beyond it. Social media lit up with hashtags like Nalinasan Accountability Matters and Oscar Justice for Robert, as people debated whether his actions were justified or too extreme. The incident became a hot topic on local news channels, talk shows, and even national platforms. Support poured in from unexpected places. Activists praised Robert for using his influence to challenge systemic issues, calling him a beacon of integrity. Community members who had long felt powerless against police misconduct rallied behind him, sharing their own stories of mistreatment. Many saw his stand as a turning point, a rare moment when someone with power chose to fight for those without. But not everyone agreed. Critics accused Robert of overreacting, claiming he was letting one bad experience cloud his judgment. Some argued that pulling funding from struggling departments would only hurt communities that relied on those resources. A few vocal opponents went so far as to label him a self-righteous bully, accusing him of wielding his wealth to punish officers unfairly. One particularly scathing editorial called his decision a dangerous precedent that could undermine trust between citizens and law enforcement. Amidst the chaos, the two officers involved in Robert's ordeal found themselves under intense scrutiny. Their names surfaced online, along with details of past complaints against them. Anonymous accounts popped up, alleging everything from verbal abuse to physical intimidation. While some defended the officers, insisting they were being scapegoated, others demanded immediate consequences. Protesters gathered outside the police station, holding signs that read "No more abuse" and "Hold them accountable." Inside the department, tensions ran high. The police chief scrambled to contain the fallout, calling emergency meetings with city officials and issuing public statements promising transparency. Internal investigations into the officers' conduct were launched, but progress was slow, bogged down by red tape and resistance from within. Whispers circulated among other officers, some sympathetic to Robert's cause, others fiercely protective of their colleagues. Meanwhile, Robert faced mounting pressure. Reporters camped outside his office, eager for sound bites. Friends and business partners urged him to reconsider, warning that alienating police departments could harm his company's future. But Robert remained resolute. He gave interviews explaining his perspective, always framing his actions as part of a larger push for reform rather than personal revenge. "This isn't about me," he repeated in every conversation. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did, or worse." As weeks passed, cracks began to form in the wall of silence surrounding the officers. Evidence emerged linking them to previous incidents of misconduct, including footage from body cameras that contradicted their official reports. Public outrage grew louder, forcing the department's hand. Finally, after weeks of delay, disciplinary action was announced. One officer was suspended without pay, while the other resigned quietly amid mounting pressure. Though far from perfect justice, the outcome marked a small victory. For Robert, it wasn't just about punishing the individuals responsible. It was about proving that accountability was possible. As headlines shifted to other topics, he allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The road ahead would still be difficult, but for now he had shown the world that standing up to power, even when risky, could make a difference. And sometimes, that was all it took to start changing the system. In the weeks that followed, Robert's stand became more than just a personal battle. It sparked a movement. His decision to challenge the police department resonated deeply with people who had long felt voiceless. Activists and community leaders seized the moment, organizing rallies, town halls, and awareness campaigns to keep the conversation alive. The small town of Ridgewood, once sleepy and unremarkable, found itself at the center of a national dialogue about accountability in law enforcement. The momentum grew when other businesses took notice. Inspired by Robert's courage, several companies began re-evaluating their partnerships with police departments, demanding stricter oversight and transparency as conditions for continued collaboration. Local governments, eager to avoid similar Controversies started reviewing policies and procedures within their own jurisdictions. Even some officers spoke out, acknowledging the need for reform and calling on their peers to embrace change rather than resist it. For Robert, this shift was both gratifying and overwhelming. He received hundreds of messages from people across the country, letters, emails, and social media comments thanking him for standing up. Many shared stories of their own encounters with police misconduct, expressing gratitude that someone finally held those in power accountable. It was humbling, but it also reminded him how widespread the problem truly was. At the same time, resistance remained fierce. Critics doubled down on their attacks, accusing Robert of creating division and undermining public safety. Some police unions launched counter-campaigns, portraying officers as victims of unfair criticism. Tensions escalated during protests, where clashes between demonstrators and law enforcement sometimes turned heated. Yet, even in these moments of conflict, Robert saw an opportunity, a chance to push harder for meaningful solutions. Behind the scenes, Integrity Solutions played a key role in driving systemic changes. Robert worked closely with tech experts to enhance his company's software, adding features that made it easier to track officer behavior and flag potential misconduct. Departments that embraced the upgrades saw improvements almost immediately. Complaints dropped, and trust between officers and communities began to rebuild. For the first time, many citizens felt heard and believed that their voices mattered. One particularly pivotal moment came when a neighboring city announced sweeping reforms inspired by Robert's efforts. They adopted new training programs focused on de-escalation techniques, implemented body cameras for all officers, and created independent review boards to handle misconduct allegations. Other cities soon followed suit, citing the success of these initiatives as proof that progress was possible. Back in Ridgewood, the two officers involved in Robert's ordeal faced lasting consequences. The suspended officer returned to duty briefly but struggled under the weight of public scrutiny. Colleagues distanced themselves, and community members openly questioned his presence on the force. Eventually, he resigned, unable to bear the pressure. The second officer, who had already quit, faded into obscurity, his reputation irreparably damaged. Through it all, Robert stayed focused on the bigger picture. He attended community forums, speaking passionately about the importance of accountability and mutual respect. Change doesn't happen overnight, he told audiences, but every step forward matters. Every voice counts. His words resonated deeply, inspiring others to join the fight, not just against abuse of power, but for a future where justice was fair and accessible to everyone. Though challenges lay ahead, Robert couldn't help but feel hopeful. What started as a humiliating night on a freezing roadside had transformed into something far greater, a catalyst for real, lasting change. And as he looked out at the faces of those fighting alongside him, he knew one thing for certain: the fight was worth it. Months after that fateful night on the icy roadside, Ridgewood had transformed. The small town, once overshadowed by whispers of misconduct and mistrust, now stood as a symbol of resilience and reform. Community meetings were packed with residents eager to discuss progress, while local leaders worked tirelessly to rebuild bridges between law enforcement and the people they served. At the heart of this change was Robert Callahan, a man who had turned personal humiliation into a catalyst for something far greater. One chilly evening, Robert found himself standing before a crowd at the town's community center. The room buzzed with energy as people filled every seat, some even leaning against the walls or sitting cross-legged on the floor. It wasn't just locals. Activists from neighboring towns, journalists, and even representatives from police departments had come to hear him speak. For Robert, it was a moment of reflection, a chance to look back on how far they'd come and acknowledge the work still ahead. "I never imagined I'd be here today," he began, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable weight. "When those officers pulled me over that night, I felt powerless, humiliated. But what hurt most wasn't the cold or the push-ups. It was realizing that my experience wasn't unique. So many others had suffered in silence because they didn't know where to turn or feared retaliation." He paused, scanning the faces in the audience. Some nodded knowingly, their expressions etched with shared pain. Others listened intently, hanging on to his every word. But then I realized something important. I wasn't powerless. None of us are. When we stand together, when we demand better, and refuse to settle for excuses, we can create change. Robert went on to share stories of victories big and small. He talked about the reforms implemented in Ridgewood and nearby cities, new training programs, independent oversight boards, and tools designed to hold officers accountable without undermining their vital role in society. He highlighted individuals who had stepped up, officers willing to champion transparency, community members brave enough to file complaints, and allies outside the system who lent their voices to the cause. Yet he didn't shy away from acknowledging the challenges. Resistance lingered in certain corners and progress often felt frustratingly slow. There were days when setbacks threatened to overshadow victories, when critics grew louder and fatigue set in. But Robert reminded everyone that meaningful change required patience and persistence. "We're planting seeds," he said. "Some will grow quickly. Others may take years. But each one matters." As he wrapped up his speech, Robert allowed himself a rare moment of vulnerability. "This journey hasn't been easy, for me, for this town, or for anyone fighting for justice. But it's taught me something valuable. Accountability isn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It's about creating a system where trust can flourish, where no one has to fear being treated unfairly because of someone else's abuse of power." The applause that followed was thunderous, filling the room with warmth despite the chill outside. People approached him afterward, shaking his hand, thanking him, and pledging to continue the fight. Among them was a young woman who introduced herself as the daughter of the elderly man, who had once been made to wait in the rain by the same officers. "You gave us hope," she told him, her eyes glistening with tears. "Thank you." Later, that night as Robert drove home through the quiet streets of Ridgewood, he allowed himself a small smile. The scars from that freezing night remained, but so did the lessons. He had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That accountability wasn't just a demand, but a responsibility shared by everyone. And that sometimes standing up for what's right could spark a fire bright enough to light the way for others. Though the road ahead would still have obstacles, Robert knew one thing for certain: change was possible. And as long as there were people willing to fight for it, the future held endless promise.